If I can help your daughter walk again, would you believe me? The voice rang out soft but piercing like a pebble, dropped onto the glassy surface of a still lake, sending ripples across the sterile silence of Sterling Pavilion's grand hospital lobby. It was a cold morning. The sunlight hadn't yet pierced through the UV-filtered glass panels covering the entire facade, but the crystal chandeliers had been lit since 6 a.m. Shards of light reflected across the cream-colored marble floors, making the whole space seem to glow, and the echoes of high-end heels played like the soundtrack of the elite. This wasn't a place for dreamers or the uninvited. Everyone who showed up here either had power money or a loved one clinging to life. Dominic Langford wore a deep grey suit, black tie, and a trench coat, brushing my knees. One hand gripped the handle of a special medical case. The other cradled Aurora, my 6-year-old daughter, asleep beneath a blush-pink cashmere blanket. Her curls spilled across her forehead, her face delicate like a porcelain doll, but her eyes vacant, void of light, as if she'd grown too weary, waiting for a miracle that never came. Her small legs hung limp. She couldn't feel them anymore, and I, a man, once capable of chairing the boards of 3 corporations at once, now stood reduced to a father, clinging to appointments I knew deep down were hopeless. Then the boy spoke. I stopped. I didn't turn right away, but suddenly the entire vast lobby seemed to freeze in time. There he was, a thin boy, crouched beside a marble pillar near the automatic doors. His dark brown hair curled slightly beneath a red knit beanie pulled low over his forehead. He wore a worn leather jacket with frayed shoulders, a half-broken zipper, and sneakers so battered they'd been taped together with silver duct tape. Beside him sat an old canvas bag, and in his hands he clutched a sketchbook, the paper yellowed a few pages, barely holding on. He stood up, closed the book, and looked directly at me. That gaze wasn't shaky, wasn't afraid, nor was it pleading or begging for sympathy. It was the gaze of someone who had seen something break and no longer feared what else might shatter. I looked down at my daughter. Her tiny hand, still able to move, gripped mine with the instinct of survival. And I wondered, what had I just heard? I can help her walk again. The boy repeated, his voice softer this time, as if he wasn't speaking to me, but to a belief someone had long since crushed out of his own heart. I didn't answer. I turned away, not because I didn't care, but because I was afraid. I might start to believe, and if I believed then, every doctor I had hired, every technology I had invested in, every theory I had once lectured on, would mean nothing. But I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't forget, because from that moment on, the boy's eyes, those torn shoes, and a promise too wild to trust, clung to me like a sentence I couldn't escape. The entire morning I couldn't focus. Every word from the doctor, every MRI scan, every neurological recovery chart slid past like static on a broken screen. Aurora lay there silent on the stark white hospital bed, an IV line running from her tiny arm to the monitor, tracking her vitals. The little girl who used to run barefoot through our garden, who sang off-key songs just to make me laugh, now exhaled in weak, fading rhythms like a shadow slowly dissolving. Dr. Carter, once hailed as a golden mind in rehabilitative medicine, said nothing's worsening, as though that was some kind of comfort. But to me, that unchanged status felt like another way of admitting defeat. I nodded, but inside, I was screaming. That evening, I sat alone in my office on the top floor of Langford Tower. Below me stretched the radiant city, a world I once ruled with spreadsheets, deals, and billion-dollar handshakes. On the desk sat a glass of untouched whiskey. Beside my laptop, my phone lay silent. The browser was still open mid-search. I had typed boy heals paralysis. No results. Draws, neurological pathways. Nothing. Homeless kid, miracle cure. Still nothing. The more I searched, the more absurd I felt. How could someone like me, a man who once spoke at the United Nations on ethics in modern medicine, be grasping at the words of a dirty, nameless child I once held the world in my hands? But tonight, I didn't have a single answer. Only one thing gripped me, pounding through my mind like Aurora's faint heartbeat: that boy's eyes. Not afraid, not begging, just filled with a strange kind of certainty that shook me, a man built on logic to the core. I walked to the window. Across the city, the lights of Elmwood Park blinked faintly through the mist. The place where the boy had said he'd wait for me. No one knew, no appointment, no media, no promises. Just a meeting point between a man drowning in despair and a child daring to offer the impossible. I didn't know if I believed, but I knew. If I didn't go, I might spend the rest of my life asking myself, what would have happened if that day I had chosen to believe just once Elmwood Park at noon was quieter than in the morning? Sunlight filtered through the leafless canopies of winter-stripped mahogany trees, casting scattered patches of light onto the worn wooden benches. I arrived not as a CEO, not as a man of influence. I came simply as a father carrying a heart so heavy that every ounce of reason that once defined me now felt meaningless. And then I saw him, the boy in the red knit hat, doodling on a crumpled piece of paper, legs crossed, his worn-out shoes swinging gently in the air as if the spinning world didn't concern him. I approached without a word. He didn't look up either. But then he held up a piece of paper, a drawing of a neural pathway sketched with colored pencils. The lines weren't perfect, but the structure was eerily accurate. I frowned. "Who taught you this?" I asked, voice dry. He shook his head. "I see it in my head. When I look at someone hurting, I know where it's broken. Like sound, but in pictures." I said nothing. I didn't argue. Because I, who had funded countless studies on functional neural mapping, had never heard an explanation so bizarre and so instinctive. The boy continued, finally raising his eyes to meet mine. "You don't believe me, but your daughter is waiting for someone brave enough to try." Then he held out a small notebook so old that every page was stained and worn. Inside were sketches, notes, and physical models written in simple language, as if meant for someone who hadn't yet learned to read. There was even a diagram of the peripheral nervous system and a small hand-drawn device resembling a leg band. I saw things that made no sense, and I saw things I once thought was impossible. Tonight, bring Aurora here. No machines, no nurses, just believe. And if nothing happens after an hour, you'll never have to see me again," he said, then bent back down to continue drawing. I stood there a few more minutes. My hands were cold, my chest heavy, but for the first time in 6 months, something strange stirred inside me. Not quite hope, not quite a belief, but something that for a man like me, a billionaire, shaped by logic, I could no longer dismiss as delusion. Elmwood Park at night felt like another world. Gone were the strolling families and the distant laughter of children. Only the wind whispered through the bare trees, and a thin layer of mist curled over the grey stone paths. I carried Aurora there, wrapped in a thick blanket, my heart pounding harder with every step. A man who had signed contracts worth hundreds of millions was now trembling like someone who had lost all sense of direction. No bodyguards, no medical team. Just me, Aurora, and a boy whose real name I didn't even know. Zeke, the name he had given me, had laid out a thin tarp near an old stone statue. He sat cross-legged, focused like a surgeon entering a life-or-death procedure, but without a lab coat or microscope, just a child with eyes that burned with an unexplainable intensity. In silence, he pulled out a small handmade device, something that looked like a band, laced with hand-drawn sensor nodes, and gently fastened it around Aurora's ankle. I instinctively moved to stop him. A wave of panic surged through me like a flood. What if it hurt her? What if he made a mistake? What if this was all just a delusional scam? But then, Aurora's eyes moved slightly. She looked at me, said nothing, but something in her gaze as if she consented. Zeke began drawing colored patterns directly onto her skin, temporary marks almost like tattoos. The designs were strange, winding like a maze connecting to thin filaments that faintly glowed in the dark. No one could explain how it worked. But when he gently touched her shoulder, a small current pulsed through, and my daughter's leg twitched. It was just a slight movement, a reflex maybe, but I broke down in tears. Zeke didn't speak. He continued this time, attaching a thin metallic patch over her pelvic bone, adjusting a tiny dial. The band's light shifted hues, and Aurora slowly bent her knee on her own. I dropped to my knees, beside her hands, covering my face heart, ready to burst. 6 months. 6 months across dozens of hospitals. 6 months of hearing the word impossible repeated like a curse. And yet tonight, in a cold, misty park, with a makeshift device and a boy no one believed in, my daughter had moved. No words could describe that feeling. No title, no wealth, no degree had ever made me feel so small, and at the same time, so profoundly grateful. The news exploded, like the world had just witnessed the ultimate betrayal. The photo of me kneeling in the park, clutching my daughter's legs beside an unnamed boy, landed on the front pages of dozens of major newspapers overnight. Billionaire Dominic Langford chooses a street kid over modern medicine. The venom came down like a hailstorm. I once hailed as the face of biomedical innovation, the so-called father of self-healing neural interfaces, was now being painted as a man spreading superstition. The first call came from the head of communications: cancel all public appearances. Legal is rewriting every press statement. The second came from the ethics board. You are forbidden to contact or speak about that child again. And the third, the most painful, came from my own mother. You're disgracing the entire family. But I couldn't turn away. Not after seeing Aurora's legs curl in, after seeing her eyes light up for the first time in half a year, filled only with pain and hopelessness. What could possibly be more real than that? But clearly to this world, truth isn't defined by what happens, it's defined by what can be proven, labeled, and approved by those in lab coats behind polished oak desks. That morning, walking into Langford BioHealth felt like walking into a courtroom. The same people who once applauded my visions of the future now sat in cold silence as if I'd committed a crime. And then, the official document arrived. We request that Dominic Langford temporarily step down as chairman of the board, pending investigation into ethical misconduct and behavior causing reputational harm to shareholders. I didn't sign it. I folded it, placed it on the table, looked up, and met their eyes. What are you really afraid of? I asked. A poor child, or a truth you can't monetize? No one answered, but I knew. I knew with painful clarity, when you place your faith in something the system can't control, you become the enemy of the very empire you built. The boardroom at Langford BioHealth felt unusually cold that day, not because of the air conditioning, but because of the stares from those who had once been my allies, now silently watching me like I was some kind of heretic. On the screen, footage of Aurora's legs curling in the park played on loop, living proof of a miracle. But instead of listening, everyone zeroed in on a single question. Are you really willing to gamble shareholder trust? On a street quack with no credentials, I didn't answer right away. Because there's something more painful than accusation. It's the apathy of those who once swore to heal, now focus solely on protecting profits. That night, I sat in my office, the city lights reflecting off a glass of whiskey I hadn't touched. On my desk lay the resignation form, glossy, sterile, cold, like a surgical table. I had once stood here when our stock hit its all-time high. I'd made thank you calls to investors, to employees. I once believed science and compassion could coexist. But now I understood. Sometimes to protect your conscience, you must let go of everything that ever made the world call you successful. I walked into the press conference the next morning with no script, no expensive suit, no communications director at my side. Just me and a USB drive containing Aurora's electrophysiological data. I looked into the hundreds of lenses pointed at me and spoke slowly. If a child once labeled a name on the slow death list can move her legs, then maybe we should be stopping everything to understand it, not rushing to erase it just because it wasn't born in a lab stamped with our logo. I took off the Langford BioHealth chairman pin and placed it on the table. I don't need power to do what's right, but I do need freedom to never stay silent when I see life flicker, even if it's just the faintest spark. Thousands stood outside the building in stunned silence. Some wept, some scoffed. But in the crowd, I saw one boy standing next to Aurora in her wheelchair, raising his hand high as if holding an invisible flag. It was Zeke, and in that moment, I knew I was no longer a CEO. I had just become a father, in every true sense of the word. From the moment I publicly stepped away from Langford BioHealth and chose to defend Zeke, the gates of hell swung wide open. They didn't come at us directly, they did something worse, they smeared us. The media ran headlines claiming I was suffering from post-traumatic psychological breakdown. A doctor, ironically one I had personally funded through a scholarship, declared I had lost all distinction between science and blind faith. And Zeke. He was branded a juvenile fraud. A federal investigation was launched, accusing him of fabricating medical records, despite the fact that he didn't even have a complete birth certificate. I had to take Aurora and Zeke out of the city that very night. No bodyguards, no lawyers, just a father, a genius child, and a little girl whose legs had just begun to move. We hid away in a wooden cabin on the outskirts of Colorado. No cell signal, no internet, only the sound of the wind and a faint glimmer of hope flickering in the warmth of a tiny kitchen. One night, with nothing left in me but desperation, I asked Zeke, why would someone like you even exist? He looked up, his deep black eyes, unwavering. Because my mother was the last patient in an experimental trial. They denied her treatment when they found out I was an unwanted pregnancy. I am the product of a system that decides who deserves to live, and I swore I'd reverse that. That night, Zeke opened his battered old laptop and showed me what he had kept hidden all this time, a redesigned neural interface code built from the very technology my company once pioneered. But this one didn't rely on imported microchips. It didn't use precious metals. It could be mass-produced for less than the cost of a fast food meal. It didn't just help paralyzed people walk. It could save the world if the world would let it live. I sat in stunned silence because I finally understood. This was no longer just about my daughter. This was a battle for the right to live, to heal, to hope, on behalf of the millions who had been cast aside simply for lacking insurance influence or value in the eyes of those perched atop the medical hierarchy. The day of the hearing, all of America seemed to hold its breath. Over 12 million people watched the live stream. The media called it the trial of the century, where a 14-year-old boy, without credentials, without power, without a single backer, stood before a panel of medical authorities, industry donors, and government officials to defend an invention that, if validated, could collapse a trillion-dollar healthcare empire. The room was stark and white, a spotlight glaring down on the witness table. Zeke, wearing a shirt too big for him, standing behind a microphone taller than his head, adjusted his glasses and began with a single sentence. "I'd like to speak, not in scientific jargon, but from the experience of a child no one ever came to save." No one spoke. Then he laid out every line of code, every signal pathway, every recovery chart from trial patients, including Aurora, seated just behind him, her feet now resting softly on the ground. And then he played a video. On the screen, Aurora stood up. No cane, no harness. She took one step, then another, walking straight toward the camera, smiling. The room erupted. Some cried, others gasped, and a few once opponents seated across from me nodded, as if for the first time they were witnessing something that transcended profit margins, a real, undeniable miracle. Zeke ended with a quiet sentence. "If a child written off by the system can help one person walk again, then imagine how many more could rise if we stopped selling life and started sharing it." The hall fell silent. And then something no one expected. The chair of the ethics board, a man known as the one who never bows, stood, walked to Zeke, and lowered his head. "Young man," he said, "you haven't just changed medicine. You've changed our hearts. I weeping not for restored titles, not for reclaimed reputation, but because my daughter had just run forward and thrown her arms around Zeke. And this boy, whom the world had once turned its back on, chose still to give nothing but love." If you've stayed with this story until the end, perhaps you feel what I feel, not just emotion, but a burning belief that in a world driven by power and calculation, there are still people willing to risk everything for one thing, only kindness. The greatest lesson in this story isn't the miraculous recovery or the scandalous exposure. It's the unwavering conviction of a father who gave up his place at the top to protect his daughter's first step, and the courage of a child, Zeke, who stood against a towering system to defend the right to live for those who'd been forgotten. The message is crystal clear. You don't need a title to make change. You only need to speak when others stay silent, to stand firm when others look away, and to keep believing, even when no one else does. Personally, I believe kindness doesn't need to be celebrated. It just needs to be held onto. And someday, your quiet defiance for what's right may echo louder than all the applause for what's wrong. If you believe this too, help me spread this story by liking, sharing, leaving your thoughts in the comments, and subscribing to Toch Story so you never miss another moving, inspiring story. Because sometimes just one video can change the way someone sees the world. And maybe that someone is you.